There we go. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Amanda, and I am the Marketing and Communications Manager at Cornerstone Counselling. And we are so excited to welcome you to our first collaborative webinar of 2024. So as I mentioned, for today's webinar, we will be recording the session, but we are not keeping the chat. And Michelle will also send a follow-up email after the session with a few resources that we mentioned. Today, we will be discussing positive psychology. This webinar is intended as educational information rather than a replacement for medical advice or training. We will be offering general advice to help you understand positive psychology, and some of these suggestions might apply to your personal or professional life. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we live, work, and prosper is Treaty 6 territory, the ancestral and traditional meeting grounds and gathering place for the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations, and we are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders. We recognize the land as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside and gather on today. So I would like to introduce our first presenter, and that is Alex Chiavoletto. She is a registered psychologist at Cornerstone Counselling, and she works with adults, couples, and families who are struggling with various issues, including anxiety, depression, and trauma. One of the things she loves most about counseling is the privilege that comes through sitting with courageous individuals every day. If you are interested in pursuing counseling with Alex, please visit our website, which is www.cornerstonecounseling.com. So as Alex mentioned, our second presenter would have been Michelle Devlin, who is the owner of Creating People Power, but she is unable to be here today. We did want to take an opportunity to still recognize all the effort that she put in to help us prepare for this webinar. So Michelle is a certified CMHA psychological health and safety advisor and is also DISC certified. She is an accomplished facilitator who is passionate about fostering respectful workplaces and helping business professionals become better leaders. If you are interested in working with Michelle, please visit www.creatingpeoplepower.ca. And our guest speaker today is Alyssa Caskey. Alyssa is a registered therapeutic counselor who also works with us at Cornerstone Counselling. She works with adults, couples, and children and teens who are facing a broad range of mental health challenges. Alyssa has a passion for aiding individuals in their pursuit of a meaningful life and utilizes compassion and understanding to help individuals develop resiliency. So if you're interested in pursuing counseling with Alyssa, you can learn more about her on the Cornerstone website as well. And with that, I will let Alex and Alyssa take it away.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And today, as many of you know, we're talking about positive psychology. And so one of the questions as we were brainstorming this webinar was we were kind of curious to know, what does positive psychology mean to you, the audience members? We're going to get into it a little bit later, some of the myths around it, what positive psychology actually is, and some strategies that you can take away from today. But we were really curious to kind of start off with this. Typically, we use Menti, an anonymous system that you can put answers in, but we weren't able to get into that today. So we're going to open up the floor to the audience members. What does positive psychology mean to you? And just as an aside, whether it be answering this question or throughout the webinar, if you're not comfortable putting it into the general chat for everyone to see, you can definitely send it just to the hosts and panelists, or you can respond through that Q&A platform on Zoom, and we would be happy to keep your anonymity protected there. Yeah. We'll give a couple minutes or seconds as we wait to see what people have to say. Alyssa, I'm curious while we're waiting, before you took your certificate course through Berkeley University on positive psychology and the science of happiness, what did you understand positive psychology to be?
So before I did that, I studied positive psychology at the university. And I worked at the lab, the Nature Meaning and Life lab. I've traveled from UBC across to the UK Derby, and done a lot of work for positive psych labs across, I guess, the globe. So I've had
Cool.
a decent amount of experience, and I just wanted to get more, I guess, more training in, I guess, from the person who is that we'll talk about later, but someone who is really impacting the current positive psychology world, Dr. Jacker Keltner.
Super exciting. And I'm glad you gave background to your extensive knowledge in this. We have quite the expert, and it is just so exciting. What a privilege. Some people have said so far, like, what does positive psychology mean to them? A few people said turning bad thoughts to good, the ability to reframe events and feelings. Maybe it's around a growth mindset. I've seen a couple times here practicing gratitude, seeing the positive in a situation, reframing situations for the positives that they might present instead of focusing on the negatives. Positive reinforcement, encouragement, leading by example with an upbeat and energetic energy. Wow, we're just getting so many responses.
That's
And it
great.
seems as though there's kind of that theme around the ability to change your mindset from things being bad to being good in a sense.
Mhm.
Well, any thoughts so far, Alyssa, on what people are sharing, or should we just get right into it?
Well, I think this is great. I think it's a great start, and I love the parts about, I'm just reading this one, the growth mindset. I love growth mindset. But yeah, I think maybe we should just get into it. What do you think, Alex?
Yes, I
Okay.
agree. Okay, so what is positive psychology? Of course, I might be able to provide a little bit of a definition. Um, In terms of the definition of positive psychology is a scientific study of human flourishing and an applied approach to optimized well-being. It has a focus on the unique individual and really building or highlighting people's mental assets and strengths. It doesn't focus on what we might call like the problems or our weaknesses, but acknowledges a lot of diversity and diverse character traits in people. So that is sort of has been my just opening understanding of positive psychology. And to be very transparent with our audience, I really, before going into this webinar, had almost no idea of what positive psychology was. So I'm speaking to a lot of just my beginner knowledge and what I've researched so far. But Alyssa, anything that I missed just about positive psychology rather in general as I open this?
Yeah, I mean, I think positive psychology is um, it's a growth-based approach to not just, focusing on what we do well, and not ignoring that we all have parts of ourselves that aren't, let's call them positive or the best strengths, but that we can use these aspects that are great about us to leverage and manage the things that aren't great in our lives.
Hmm. I love the focus on growth. Yes. You know, as you say that too, it makes me just recognize a lot of the myths around positive psychology, many of which I came in with. And I wonder if some of our chat today will help to dispel or change just our understanding in general of positive psychology. So maybe with that, we might share with folks some of the myths and stereotypes that we found.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so debunking myths, what positive psychology is not. And again, I will say, I think I fell into the trap of understanding it as these myths. So number one, it's not just about practicing appreciation or gratitude. I resonated with that one because honestly, I did believe at first that that was a huge part of positive psychology. Secondly, and what you see here on the slide, positive psychology is not just about toxic positivity. There has been a lot of conversation in the media and in social media and books around this topic of toxic positivity. And I find with folks, there's a lot of like defensiveness now to that word positivity. People might believe that positive psychology is about like forced happiness. We hear a lot of times from people in our lives like, oh, why can't you just be happy? And so I know some people believe maybe that positive psychology is just this happyology in a sense. And secondly, on the slide here, another myth that positive psychology doesn't leave any room for negative emotions. Again, it almost feeds into that like forced happiness. If we're going to be positive, it feels like there's no space to attend to all the other emotions that come into the experience of our lives. And the last myth is that positive psychology encourages avoidance or excuse making. Some folks I've heard or might say that by focusing on like positives or strengths, maybe we're not attending to like the reality of a situation, or that, yeah, we're making excuses for behaviors or things going on. Anything that, you've seen in myths, Alyssa?
I think you're touching on some of the really important ones. I hear a lot of, well, you're neglecting all the things that make life really impactful, such as the hurt and the process of growth, which tends to be more painful. And I want to stress that positive psychology, I think the word positive gives its problem, right? Which is, okay, so we're only doing positive things. But positive psychology at its heart is, not avoiding, but recognizing and building. And I think we'll talk about that in our next slide. But I think you covered it. It's not happyology, and it's not neglectful of the things that aren't great. It's also not avoiding and sort of, okay, well, if we don't think about that, then I don't have to deal with it type of mindset or mind frame.
Thank you. Yes, I someone just posted in the chat, like, this is super helpful. And I even wonder if some of the myths originally fed into all of the original responses, which, I mean, again, I will say that I believed positive psychology to be that, but I think that folks are finding this super helpful.
Yeah, I think this is a question. Is that a question? Well, there's a question mark. So we have to feel our emotions and figure out how and where we wish to put our mindset at our yeah, absolutely. It's not ignoring. Positive psychology is not ignoring that we're in a bad mood or something's upsetting us. It's really giving us the toolkit to recognize, okay, I might not be happy, but that doesn't mean that I need to let this ruin my day.
I love that. Yeah. Why don't you take us away into some foundational practices? No. I feel like you're segueing so beautifully into that.
Yeah. So the foundational practices. So positive psychology, it's not selfish psychology, and it gets, that's another, I guess, myth about it. It's very, individually focused, and it is, but for a good reason, because it's really built on identifying one's true character strengths. And that's an important step for this road that we build on our values and virtues. And it helps us create this meaningful approach to what we do and why we do it. And it's also a great way to build our mental assets. I like to think of positive psychology as kind of like a toolkit, and you're building your toolkit by using the things that are in alignment with who you are, what you want out of life, and your values and your strengths. So it's definitely identifying things that we do well, but not ignoring what we don't do well. And it helps us address our weaknesses from a less, or I guess a better way of putting it is, it identifies our weaknesses from a way of acknowledging them but not defeating ourselves in the process, that we do have weaknesses. Anything to add to that, Alex?
No, I just think beautifully put, and that speaks to maybe what someone put in the chat there, that it's almost like building our own way of personal coaching. And kind of what I heard from you there too, Alyssa, is it's just very empowering of saying like, yes, you have the tools. Let's build up some of that. And then you get to make the choices that lead your life, lead how you are in the workplace, relationships, that kind of thing. So just from my conversations with you and learning about it, it does feel just so encouraging, so empowering. So yeah, that's all I was going to add.
Yeah, no, and I love that because it's definitely a way of empowering ourselves. So let's talk a little bit about where positive psychology came from. So the term is not new. It's been floating around since the 1950s. But what we in the field refer to it as the fourth wave. And it's basically this huge mindset change within the realm of psychology that took us from looking at mental illness as a pathological perspective and totally changing that towards human flourishing. So let's talk about who created it. So the founding fathers of positive psychology are Martin Seligman and Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. His last name is a little bit difficult to pronounce, but essentially the two of them have worked together since, I would say, the late 90s, early 2000s, and they've done some revolutionary work on shifting this pathological perspective and really focusing the study on, okay, well, human beings are not just what's wrong with them. It's also, what makes life meaningful and what makes people feel that life is worth living. And that goes down to their studies of well-being, human flourishing. And it created this fourth wave, but it also changed how we treat a lot of the aspects of positive psychology, including happiness, strength, resiliency. I'm sure everyone's heard the word resiliency. You're so resilient. But that's where it came from. It came from this idea that we don't have to focus on solely the things that we do wrong, but we can also build on what we do well. Anything you want to add?
Okay. No, I really like your emphasis on just like changing the language from that focus on pathology to flourishing. I think that's just very like freeing for people.
Sorry, I wasn't clicking. There we go.
Okay. And a part of what you've shared, Alyssa, and what I've looked into about positive psychology is really this emphasis on the self-determination theory. And again, although I'm not trained in positive psychology, when I came to learn about self-determination theory, this resonated so much with me because some of the other frameworks that I utilize, like existential frameworks, attachment-based pieces in the counseling room too, I really just resonated again with these three pillars of self-determination theory. Do you want to describe a little bit about like what is self-determination and just kind of briefly define the three pillars and kind of why they're important?
Yeah, so self-determination theory is essentially this perspective that says if we have these three things, if we feel these three things, which is competence, I feel like I can have some control over my life. I feel like I can do things. I have autonomy, which is, I feel like I both have choice and I can choose to do things that I want to do. That also, the third pillar would be relatedness. And if I have these three things, if I have people in my life that I feel close to, that I feel connection, then with these three pillars, and I like to, think about it as a triangle, you can't have one without, the other. So if I don't feel the relational part, I'm not going to have self-determination theory. I'm not going to feel fulfilled. And essentially what it says is if you have these three things, then those are our human basic needs. And when they're met, that's when flourishing can occur.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting as you say that, and I wonder if some of our audience, I'm just checking the chat to make sure I haven't missed anything, if some of our audience resonates with that, like when you can feel like you've got two of the three or one of the three, something just in your life does not feel complete or whole. And oftentimes, I would almost say those are like the drivers of why folks come into the counseling space. And
Absolutely.
even taking it into like the workplace, when people are missing these pillars in their work experience, they're not feeling like they have the autonomy or the competence or that sense of community with their colleagues. That's too where like workplaces can sort of go awry.
Absolutely. If you think about, yes, self-determination theory again, self-based, but it's really focusing on how we present in our lives, and we're not the same person that we are at work as we are at home, but we take these things with us. And so, yeah, you're right. If we're missing, if you don't have any competence or you feel like you don't have competence at work, you're not going to be able to build those relationships. You're not going to have that sense of choice because you're always going to be worried about one thing or the other.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, as you say that, that sort of speaks to the next slide that we have too of the why. Like, why are we talking about this today? Why is this important? Number one, we sort of already covered a huge piece of dispelling the myths and stereotypes. And sort of the second point there, you and I were just speaking about the benefits seen in the workplace. And lastly, just how this fosters change in the counseling space. Um, I can imagine that just with the passion that you're speaking to this topic, Alyssa, people are probably really grasping like the why of our webinar. Anything to add to your why of why positive psychology is so important?
For me, myself,
Yeah, and it could be sort of in any of these three domains, like why it matters in the counseling space, or why you feel like there's such a place for this just in people's lives.
I think very similar to what you and I have chatted about is, a lot of clients come in, or people in general I've seen or spoken to say, well, I feel like I don't have, the skill set. I see a lot of these negative things, and they often come to counseling with, here's all my problems, fix them. And that's a really tough place to be. And in society, we have this very negative bias. And that's something I'll talk about a little bit later in our presentation. And this factor within our society is we'll hold on to the negative part a lot easier than we hold on to the positive. But the thing with that is that there's no growth in it. There's no ability to expand or change when we're constantly in a place of, I'm not good enough. And so for me, positive psychology really debunked that idea that there's something inherently wrong with us as humans because we have emotions and we're not always feeling the happy, joyful experiences.
That's an incredible takeaway. Yes. Oh, brilliant. Um, I know we already like talked about the myths and stereotypes. We were just going to briefly touch on like, what do the critics and skeptics say? Maybe some of you are feeling a little bit skeptical even as we've opened this up. And so I also welcome if you want to send just a chat to us hosts or anonymously in the Q&A form. We welcome some skepticism, of course, and some criticism too on this. But just to kind of highlight, like, what do the skeptics say about positive psychology? Number one, that we've heard, that we've experienced and seen, that positive psychology is a selfish act. Because it is so self-focused, I think it gets that bad rap of being almost self-centered in a way. Whereas, you've already spoken to how it's not that. You need, in order to have good relationship with people and the world around you, you have to build awareness within yourself first. And then the second piece, I know Michelle resonated with this one and was the person that brought this up in our conversations, a lot of people can feel jaded around like the one act of kindness isn't going to change the world. Michelle, as many of you know, just a wonderful person and really values being generous with her time, doing those one act of kindness. And she's run into that, as I'm sure so many of us have, where that one act of kindness is sort of criticized, like, what's it going to do? And lastly, the skeptics would say, you need to find happiness, like, rather than like, you can't build it per se. And I think this speaks to what somebody said in the chat. Happiness is internally found, is internal and not found outside of us. Yeah. And I wonder, Alyssa, I think we're going to add to that.
Yeah. Happiness in itself, I'm always cautious about talking about happiness, because you're right, it's a big thing, and people always say, oh, you gotta go, I'm trying to find what makes me happy. And yes, it's not found outside of ourselves, but I would also like to argue that it's not found at all. It's created and it's cultivated. So much like our workplace culture, much like the families and the relationships we build happiness. We do not find it. So it comes from within, and we all have happiness. We can become happier, but we can't, unfortunately, set out, even though there are some joys that we can gain from external things, but that won't build lasting happiness.
Are you telling me that I didn't find happiness in my cup of coffee this morning? I'm just kidding.
I think that there's moments of joy that come from that.
You're right. You're absolutely right. You created that coffee. Yes,
Absolutely.
all right. It didn't just pop up on the table for me. You're right. There had to be some work put in to achieve that happiness. Good catch. So instead of kind of the skeptics and the myths, we've touched on the history a little bit too, but I thought, and Michelle thought, it would be really good to leave some space for like, what do the experts say about everything that we sort of touched on so far? And, although I don't necessarily work from this lens, after reading more about positive psychology, I've actually seen, I guess, the impact of positive psychology in couples counseling. I've really seen, like, with couples that I see who focus on their strengths and are able to see the strengths in their partner, there is almost like this growth mindset, and there's this working towards like being a team essentially and building off of what each other brings to the table. There's not this focus on the weaknesses. And from that, I would even say it's like cultivated appreciation and gratitude in relationships, which is a wonderful byproduct. But in terms of like the experts within positive psychology, what do they sort of say around some of these topics?
The conversations that occur at the tables for most of these experts goes really, I think it aligns a lot with the work of Dr. Ryan Nemec, and he's a phenomenal psychologist and educator. He spearheads the VIA Institute of Character currently, and I've had the pleasure of working with him, and he's both really down to earth in this idea that who we are as humans and who we are as people and what we bring to the table is how we create these lives of meaningful connection and develop our skill set, so we have resources to face the challenges in life. And so his current work, and there's a link, I think, right? I'm not sure if Amanda will be sharing it, but you can take his character strength survey and his mindfulness practice program, which really does cultivate a lot of the tools that we'll talk about today. But yes, I think what Alex is bringing up is relational piece within positive psychology is huge when we shift that idea of blame, whether it's blame within ourselves, blame without, in our relationships as well.
Thank you. Yes, there's so many. The wonderful thing that I found about positive psychology is there's a lot of resources that are very accessible. There's not this like gatekeeping around it. And so I'm glad that so many links are going to be shared throughout the webinar. And at the end, we have a ton of resources for folks. So stay tuned for that. But just as you were kind of saying that relational piece, it made sense for us to highlight like where we can see the impact of positive psychology in our lives. And of course, all of these, in a sense, are relational pieces, you know, whether you're a parent or you're caregiving for parents who are older, the relationships with your partner and friends, relationships that we see in the workplace, within ourselves. And even to, we added this last one when we aren't mentally healthy, like experiencing grief. Maybe you've lost somebody or experienced grief or loss because of a transition or change in your life, that positive psychology can even show up there. And I wonder, Alyssa, if you can speak to, I mean, any of the 5 that we have on or something that we've missed, but even that like last piece about positive psychology's place around grief and loss.
You know, a lot of the work in positive psychology is based on finding meaning and finding happiness, or the sense of fulfillment, developing our sense of resiliency and owning our tool set when we are faced with adversity. So it's not that, okay, you know, you can't grieve, because that's not part of positive psychology. Grief is a huge place where we make meaning, whether it's, you know, from an actual loss of someone in our lives, or maybe it's a loss of a relationship or a workplace, or there's so many different types of losses, as you know, Alex. So I hope that covers that.
Oh, that was wonderfully put, that it just, there's this emphasis on making meaning. And again, too, we've already dispelled a lot of these myths. I think initially people might believe that positive psychology is just like, let's push forward, let's not think about it. Like, what was good about this thing that you might have lost? You know, what would you take away from that? But positive psychology is very different from that, and gives so much space to experience full range of emotions. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, actually, before you go on, I just have one last thing to say about that. The thing with positive psychology is it's not that we don't want to feel things. I would like to encourage people to recognize that whatever you feel, your let's call them negative emotions, even though I would like to argue that there are no negative emotions. You know, whatever you feel that on the uncomfortable side of things, the flip side is how deeply you will feel the same happy or positive emotions. And that, I think, can also be a great leverage of strength in, okay, so if this is how hard it is right now, think about how great things will be, or how you can experience this the opposite way.
You and I mean, as I'm sure so many people in the audience would agree, we could have full conversations on emotions and like this idea of positive and negative. But it goes back to what you said at the beginning. I think some of the tricky part of all of this is just the terminology used, because that's where like stereotypes come in around those terms. Yeah. Well, now I know so many of you are here because you want the strategies. You want to be able to take away some practical tips from our webinar. Well, luckily for you, we're at this point now. And we've got some really cool stuff on deck. We're going to talk more about Dr. Ryan Nemec. Did I say his name right?
Yeah, you're good.
Found his like VIA Institute and strength surveys that folks can take. We're going to touch on the DISC assessments that Michelle can provide for workplaces, and just some sort of accessible resources that are out there. But first, one of the strategies that we talked about a lot was around like appreciation and gratitude, but we also know there's some myths involved with that. So I'm going to get Alyssa to kind of take it away first with how appreciation and gratitude might fit into all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I think it's funny that you talked about coffee earlier, Alex, because I want to consider, before we get started on gratitude, I want everyone to consider a very minor issue. So let's say you get lukewarm coffee on a flight. So you've got, this wonderful experience, but it's now, you've got, cold or lukewarm coffee. That tends to really overshadow or, shift our focus from, life was great. I was having this great flight and, I'm going somewhere exciting to now I'm frustrated. This wasn't a great experience. It's an annoyance in my life. And so when we cultivate gratitude, that's our piece of moving. I like to think about it as you're moving on a chessboard. When you use gratitude, you can shift your focus from, well, that was annoying, to, okay, I don't need to let that ruin my whole day. There's also a lot of science to gratitude itself. And so gratitude activates a really cool part of our reward system in our brains, and that helps us boost our mood. It fosters resilience. It also increases our health, such as lowering our blood pressure. So gratitude has a profound impact on our lives, not just on our mental state. And true gratitude involves acknowledging this idea of genuine thankfulness. So gratitude in itself is not, I hear this a lot, like I should just be more grateful in my life. Okay, well, when you get a parking ticket, saying I am so grateful for that parking ticket isn't going to shift anything. That's not gratitude. That's, toxic positivity, or toxic gratitude is what I'll call it. But essentially, when we are authentically grateful, when we focus on things that truly matter to us, that is when gratitude occurs. And it's a totally different feeling within ourselves. And so when we use this, we talk about gratitude in the practice of feeling, and modern research really does. It supports this idea of fostering generosity, patience, and less materialism. And so that's super important for the workplace or any of our relationships, because the more grateful I am for what I'm truly thankful for in my life, it means that I'm going to be operating from a place of fulfillment, and I'm not going to be out there being selfish. So the opposite of what people think, positive psychology is, very selfish psychology. When I'm fulfilled, I don't need to make that anyone else's problem. So I'm going to go over just a quick, way to use gratitude in itself, which is, so I want you to think about when you're practicing gratitude, the active practice is thinking about something that you have in your life already that exists, not going out there trying to find things in the day. And that can be a practice, but I would suggest starting with things that already are good. And then you can use that to help you when you have those difficult situations. Remind yourself, like, okay, so yes, I got a parking ticket, but you know what? I have a really great family, and I know that I can go home and I can say, this was a really frustrating day, and they're not going to, be upset with me. That's gratitude, which now means I don't have to be upset about the lukewarm coffee. I can move past it.
Wow. Even as you said that for me, and I'm sure some light bulbs are going off for folks listening, you're welcome to share like what you just took from that. But it just dawned on me, there can feel like this forced, like, oh, I need to look around me and see like, what should I be grateful for? What could I be grateful for? And one of the traps in that is noticing all of the things that aren't right or aren't well, right? Like, if I'm just your example there, you're going out to work, you're trying to notice what you're grateful for, and then you see the parking ticket. Well, that sucks. And then the traffic's bad. Well, I'm not grateful for that. Versus just foundationally having like a base to rest in, where it's like, this is something that I do already have in my life. I don't have to find it. I just know it. Beautiful. I have so much to learn.
Alex, I think that fits so well into our next slide because it's what we already have. And so I'll link this to the idea of self-determination theory, right? So if we already have areas in our life that we feel competent, we already have areas in our life where we have relational experiences, we already have, areas in our life where we feel that, what did I miss? Autonomy, competence, and
It is autonomy. Yep.
yeah.
Related to
So when we have those three things, we can use that as a gratitude practice as well. So now we're going to talk about using our strengths. So self-assessments. And I'm sure Alex will also argue this, but self-assessments, this is a snapshot of a part of who we are. This is not who we are 100% all the time. No questions about it. So be mindful of that. So there's two that I think are really helpful for the field of positive psychology. The first one is the work of Dr. Ryan Nemick, and Dr. Segelman's work on character strengths. And so you can take it's a scientific survey. It's a little bit lengthy, but it does really focus on what we can do well. And it gives us this really great list of our core strengths or top strengths. And then it'll also break it down into, our more mild strengths out of the 24, and then our lesser strengths, which also gives us an idea of, okay, so if this isn't what I'm great at, I can use maybe my topper strengths to alleviate that or to help me improve in those areas. And then the second one is the positive and negative affect schedule. And so what I love about this one is that it's this universal idea that we can look at 4 basic quadrants as human beings. So we can plot ourselves on either, maybe we're a mad scientist, maybe we're a sober judge, maybe we're cheerleaders, maybe we're, a stormy pessimist, or I think the other word for that is a poet. And the great part about it is that positive psychology really focuses on this idea that just because we don't have certain things, not everyone in the room is going to be a cheerleader. And thank goodness, because if you're a cheerleader all the time, or if you have a room full of people who are just cheerleaders, that means that they're not going to be the person who's going to consider a lot of the things that could go wrong in a situation. So we need different types of people to build the types of environments that we need. So I think we'll just go into the next one, unless you want to add anything to that, Alex.
No, I think you opened that up really well. And someone had a question about the Panis link, that it wasn't working. And I'm wondering, because I clicked it and it does work for me. I wonder if it's maybe like if you're on a laptop or a phone, because what it is it takes you to a PDF. So another way that you might go around this is just searching up the positive and negative affect schedule to see if, like, there should be something that comes up on Google that takes you to it.
Yeah, actually, I can see if I can pull up a different. Oh, there we go.
Oh, okay, I see.
Okay, give me, you know what, I have another link that would work for that. So just, Alex, if you want to chat about, here, I'll switch this slide and then.
Perfect. Yeah. I'll touch a little bit on the disc. So we wish Michelle was here, because she is truly just such an expert on the disc assessments, and she often brings these disc assessments to workplace organizations. And we actually did one within Cornerstone. And essentially what a disc assessment is it shares insights around who you are as an employee in your workplace, the values that you bring, what your strengths are, what the lesser strengths are, but it's very detailed in that it shares, it communicates to you like areas that you're going to flourish in, things that you might need to watch out for, and it can be a really good communication tool in understanding more about your colleagues. And bridging the gap from things feeling so individual and maybe moving organizations more to like a collaborative, very open culture. So DISC, we did it, and I was just so impressed. You think you know yourself and your colleagues, but to be able to actually understand it at a deeper level, it just made so much more sense. And I think it provides a lot of information in terms of how we can work more effectively, more efficiently, and just feel better about being in the workplace. Alyssa, anything to kind of add on DISC assessment?
I think you touched on a lot of it. And one thing I really love about the DISC assessment was, and I think you touched on this, but the fact that it gives you a sample of who you are in the workplace, right? And it also gives everyone like a how to use this, how to implement this into the workplace, how to use this with other people, or how to motivate you. And I think that additional piece of information, so the character strength survey will give you you as a person, your top qualities, your top values and strengths, but the DISC assessment will give you that more breadth of knowledge as to how do I use this. That's great. I can see that, I have these things in my life. Maybe I'm a pursuer, maybe I'm someone who's really good at being a supportive person in the workplace, but what do I do with that? So I love that about the DISC assessment.
It is just so robust in nature. It's quite amazing. Someone asked more about the DISC assessment, and I see that Amanda's put in the chat, reaching out to Michelle and her team, and we'll definitely make sure she's put Michelle's website, www.creatingpeoplepower.ca, but definitely too in the information that we're going to send post webinar today, we'll make sure you have her contact info and all the info on that. It is something that you can complete, I believe, just as an individual with her, but she can also come into an organization, small organization, big organization, and have all the employees, including management, complete it too. So I think there is some options around that. Okay. And I guess this is the title of our webinar, and I would hope something that you've been getting from so much of the conversation that Alyssa and I have been having, how to be this influencer in your workplace. Number one, knowing your strengths, being able to share your strengths with other people, bringing people into that conversation just allows more collaboration. And I also feel like a greater sense of understanding and compassion. If I know that my colleague does not share in this strength that I might have, whether that be like I'm thinking creativity. If I'm very high in creativity and my colleague is not, then I might not assume that they can do a creative task or use that strength in the same way that I can. And so maybe I'll pull them in if they're more of like a logical, analytical type person. And so it just encourages, I would say, more compassion in the workplace. Also, knowing your strengths encourages a sense of accomplishment and purpose to better relationships with others. Anything that you might add to how this means we can be influencers in our workspace, Alyssa?
I think you've touched on a lot of the really important pieces. And I hope that people take away, that it's not the what we don't have or what we don't do well. It's utilizing things that we do well to build other people together.
Yeah, build. That's such a good word, how we can build each other up. So, being that influencer, what we hope is maybe you reach out to Michelle and do the DISC. Maybe you read more into positive psychology or do some of those quick self-assessments. And you're going to go into relationships in your lives with this knowledge, and it might translate or influence other people to do the same thing. It becomes, what's the word I'm looking for? Just people can feel that energy from you and they will build off of that essentially. Yeah.
I think what you're talking about is transcendence, right? Which is
Yes,
where we
exactly.
really change and motivate other people, but also flourish.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, here we are with the resources. We've got lots of different resources to share, and I'll get Amanda to kind of take away the rest of our presentation for everyone.
Sounds good. Thank you both so much for covering that positive psychology information. I feel like that was a lot of info in 15 minutes. So thank you very much. Okay, so our first resource for you is a membership. And we would recommend becoming a member of the Canadian Positive Psychology Association. So they have a variety of conferences, seminars, and webinars throughout the year that focus on different elements of positive psychology. They also have a book club, which is kind of a fun way to talk about how we can integrate positive psychology not only into our workplace, but into our personal lives as well. So I will just shoot this link into the chat right there. Okay. Our next resource is a list of a couple different articles. So this first one is one that I've already shared in the chat at the very beginning of the presentation. And it's a pretty short article that just describes the basics of what we've covered today. You'll learn how positive psychology is different than other psychologies and how it's applied in the counseling room. The second article is a list of gratitude apps that you can use throughout the day to kind of remember what Alyssa said, and I mean, not be toxic positivity all the time or leaning on that happyology concept, but it's a way to kind of just integrate gratitude into your life if you are feeling a bit down. And it also talks about the physical health benefits of gratitude, which is very interesting. The third article is about positive psychology in the workplace. So we find this is very relevant for people in leadership positions. Not to say that you can't have an influence on your team if you're not a manager or higher, but just in leadership positions, how you can promote happiness, stay energized, and utilize self-determination in your workplace. So the link is right there. And then the fourth article is actually from the US Department of Veteran Affairs. And I'll just put it in here as well. There we go. So this is a really interesting article that talks about the importance of gratitude and how it's a combination of an attitude and a practice. So similarly to what Alex and Alyssa talked about is how building happiness is something that you actively work on. It's not just automatically found or bought. Okay, our next set of resources is a podcast, I believe. Yes. So the Science of Happiness podcast is hosted by an award-winning positive psychology professional, Dacher Keltner. And I've checked out a couple episodes. They have differing lengths. So if you only have 10 minutes in the morning, you can pop one of these on, learn a little bit more about happiness, how to create a meaningful life, and also learn about compassion, gratitude, mindfulness, and the importance of awe, which I think is something that we often forget in our busy lives. So some of the episodes, like I mentioned, are short, 10 minutes. Some are a little bit longer and dive a little bit deeper into topics, but highly recommend this free resource. And then lastly, this is a list of 15 gratitude apps for positive thinking. So in our meetings leading up to this webinar, Michelle mentioned that she uses the gratitude app. And we are also quite familiar with the 5-minute journal. So that is, right now it's a really popular book form, but there's also an app version if you would prefer to have it on your phone. So these are just other tools to utilize to integrate happiness, positive psychology, gratitude into your life. Okay, and with that, we would love to hear your feedback on today's webinar. So if you scan the QR code, you will be taken to a Google form just to provide some short feedback to us. If you are interested in pursuing counseling or learning a little bit more about Cornerstone, you can always reach out to us at the phone number and the website below. And like we mentioned, if you are interested in pursuing a DISC assessment with Michelle and her team. You can call the number or visit their website and learn a little bit more about their process for that. Thank you all so much for joining, and we'll see you in the next webinar, which is happening in May. Take
Thank you
care.
so much, everybody. And thank you so much,
you.
Alyssa, for coming and just providing so much wisdom for us. This was wonderful.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
Have a great day.